to. Anyone in the back? There's a whole row here in the front. I know it's a bit daunting, but you're welcome to come to it. Right, hi everyone, welcome. We're really excited to have Professor Annie Sutherland here today. Professor Sutherland is the Professor of Medieval Literature and the Rosemary Wolfe Fellow, as well as tutor in Old and Middle English at Somerville College. And today I'm just going to be giving the presentation on what it's like to study English at Oxford. And I have two ambassadors who are going to be here to answer questions and speak to it. I will send them down.
Perfect.
But without further ado, can we have a warm welcome to and for our ambassadors, just keep it going a little bit. Yeah.
So just to introduce the two ambassadors, at the end is Guan, who's just finished his second year as an English student at Somerville, and here we have Arthur, who's just finished his first year as an English student at Wadham. And I'll be sort of asking them to come up and say a few things at various points while I'm talking. I hope you can all hear me okay. Okay, so I want to talk to you very generally about the English faculty to start with, and then about the contents of the English course, then about the ways in which you would be taught if you were to come here, and then if there's time at the end, I'd like to say a little bit about the application process and interviews. And I do have a PowerPoint. It's not working in front of me, it is working up there, so I'll be sort of looking back a few times if that's okay. So the first thing to tell you about the English course at Oxford is that it's really the most comprehensive English course in the country. We asked students to study literature from around the year 650, that what we call Old English literature, right up until the present day. So if you were to come here as students, you would study a huge sort of historical sweep of literature, beginning in 650, moving up to 2024. We call it, or you call it, one calls it an English degree, but really the degree that we offer is a degree that focuses on literature in English. In other words, we encourage you to study literature written in English in any part of the globe. We encourage you to study what you might have heard described as Anglophone literature. And alongside that, you can also study, if you want to, literature that has been translated into English from other languages. So for any given paper that you're studying, and I will run through the papers with you in a moment, a third of any one of those papers can be taken up with translated texts. The other really important thing to tell you is that the degree that we offer is very specifically a degree in English language and literature. So it's not just a literature degree, it's a degree that in your first year requires you to work specifically on language. And then you have options to pursue your interests in language if you so choose in your second and third years. So you don't just think about literary texts when you get here, you also get to think about language in other contexts. And you get to think about how and why we use the words that we do. So what you get when you come to Oxford is a uniquely expansive degree. And the other thing to tell you is that the English faculty in Oxford is, I think, the biggest faculty in the country. So if you were to come here, you would be very, very likely to encounter specialists in even the most niche of your interests. So I think that's all I wanted to say generally about the course. I now wanted to take you through the contents of the course. So broadly speaking, the degree course in English language and literature is divided into two parts. The first year is a part by itself, and then the second and third years form the second part of the degree. So the first year is a year that we call prelims. And it's a year in which you study 4 papers on which you are examined at the end of the year. Papers 2, 3 and 4 up here are conventional period papers. They're papers that are examined by a 3-hour exam at the end of your first year. But the first paper, which I just want to talk about briefly, the Introduction to English Language and Literature, is a paper that's examined by means of a portfolio of coursework, one essay and one piece of linguistic analysis or commentary. So to start with paper one, this is a really brilliant paper. It's a paper in which we encourage you to take apart everything that you think you know about English language and literature, and then begin to slowly reassemble it, to slowly put it all back together. For the language part of the paper, also there's one other thing I should have said, which is that you absolutely don't need to have done an English language A-level to make a competitive application to Oxford. If you're just doing English literature, that's completely fine. If you're doing combined English language and literature, that's also fine. We don't require you to have done a language A-level. Anyway, the language part of the paper is fantastic. It gives you a chance to think about the English language in so many different ways and contexts. You could look at dictionaries, you could look at dialect, you could look at text speak, at internet language, at theories of rhetoric, of metaphor. I mean, the list is almost endless. And as I said to this group yesterday, one of the best pieces of work that I ever read for this paper was a linguistic analysis of some instructions on how to use a piece of gym equipment. So you can really sort of do things that are distinctly non-literary in your linguistic work for this paper. And then for the theory part of the paper, the literature part, you get a chance to revisit some of the theoretical approaches to texts that I think lots of you must be working on at the moment for your A-levels. So you can look in more depth than you've been able to do so far at feminist theory, at post-colonial theory, at postmodernism, at modernism, at eco-criticism, at vegan readings of literature. There's a huge variety in what's on offer in the teaching for that paper. Gwan, can I just get you to come up here and talk a little bit about what you did in your portfolio for prelims paper one, if you can remember?
Whoa.
Or should I ask Arthur, given that he did it more recently?
I think yours is funnier.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's have
probably
Arthur. Arthur's funnier than Gwan, generally.
Okay, so for my language paper, I compared two different texts, one of which was a speech by Keir Starmer, and one of which was the manifesto of one of my local campaign candidates. So very topical, and it's been really, really useful, especially as we sort of approach a general election right now, to kind of be able to look at political language and kind of, it's quite frustrating as well, because you can kind of see, oh, I know exactly what you're doing. You're kind of learning how to unpick how people are saying their opinions without saying their opinions. And so that's something that I found really enjoyable. And then just sort of to show you kind of how kind of diverse this can be, for my literature side of the paper, I'm quite interested in theatre and performance. And so I wrote about sort of, is a play sort of if it's never ever going to be performed? And so it's quite a kind of, abstract theoretical question, but I thought that it was really nice to be able to do that kind of diversity, and one that's very practical and one that's kind of more woohoo.
Yeah, and nice to have a paper that isn't examined by a 3-hour exam at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's quite nice.
Yeah. So there's some variety in the assessment over the first year. So alongside that paper one, you take these 3 period papers. I'll explain to you a little bit about prelims paper 2, just because it's the one that looks least familiar to you all. So this is the early medieval literature paper. This is the paper that takes students from around the year 650 to around the year 1350. It's a compulsory paper. You all have to take it. In fact, you all have to take all of these papers as English students. The early medieval paper is the paper that students are most often most daunted by when they arrive in Oxford. But the really lovely thing about it is that none of you will arrive in Oxford already a specialist in the Old English language and in Old English literature, unless you've chosen to spend your post-A-level summer learning Old English. which you could do, that would be fine. But anyway, you all arrive sort of on a level playing field. You're taught primarily for this paper in your college, although you also have some lectures in the faculty, and we'll explain that in a moment. But it's a paper in which you can really get to know your college cohort of English students well, and get to know your English tutors really well. And I would say that of all of the first year papers, this is, the most daunting, but in some ways actually the most rewarding. I mean, it's a unique part of the English course at Oxford. And then papers 3 and 4 are, standard period papers, the first of which looks at Victorian literature, and the second of which looks at modern literature. For all of these papers, your college tutor will take you through a certain number of canonical texts. You won't escape Dickens if you're in your work on the Victorian paper, and you won't escape Woolf or Joyce in your work on modern literature. But we'll also give you lots of time and space to explore particular interests of your own in consultation with your college tutor. The last thing I want to say about this prelims year before we move on is that it sometimes strikes applicants as odd that we require you to study Old English literature in your first year alongside studying modern literature. But actually this is a really, really brilliant and generative conjunction of papers. It encourages you to think in really interesting and unusual ways about points of connection and difference between very old texts and very recent texts. It encourages you to think about how literature both has and hasn't changed. And it encourages you to see echoes of the medieval in the modern and anticipations of the modern in the medieval. So it's a wonderful paper. They're all wonderful papers. Now, the reassuring thing that I can tell you about prelims is that it's very hard to fail. It's actually statistically much harder, and I think Juan has a keener awareness of the statistics than I do, but I think it's statistically much harder to get into Oxford than it is to fail prelims. The mark that you get in your prelims exam has no bearing on the overall degree classification that you get at the end of your third year. The prelims exams are purely internal exams, and they're there just for us to check as your tutors that you've understood the sorts of questions that we've been asking you to think about in your first year. But all you have to do is pass, and it is difficult not to pass. So that's what happens in your first year. And then in your second and third years, you take what we call FHS. FHS is Final Honours School. So these are the standard papers that students studying English language and literature choose to study or have to study across the degree. And again, as with prelims, there's a variety of assessment modes, which I'll just explain to you. So you can see that there are 4 standard period papers taking you through literary texts from 1350 right up until 1830. So those are 4 papers that you study for across the 2 years of your FHS work, of your Final Honours School work. And they are all examined by conventional 3-hour exams at the end of your third year. So those are the sort of foundation of FHS. And then around those core papers, you take 3 coursework papers, which I'll just explain to you briefly. Actually, I think I'll get Gwan to come up and talk a little bit about his in a moment. But first of all, you take a Shakespeare paper, and that paper is taught across the second and third years. And it's examined by a portfolio of 3 short essays on a Shakespearean topic, which I'll ask Gwan to talk about in a moment. So that's what you do across your second and third years. Then at the beginning of your third year, you take what we call a special option. Now, a special option is a course that is taught centrally in the English faculty. So unusually for English students, this is a course for which your primary teaching doesn't take place in your college. It takes place here in the faculty, or actually not here in the faculty, because the faculty is about to move to somewhere much nicer, I should say. The special options on offer vary from year to year, but in any given year you're bound to get around 20 options to choose from, and you have to decide at the end of your second year which of these options you'd like to take. So in recent years we've had things like the American novel, post-war British drama, post-colonial literature, Icelandic saga, feminism, film criticism, tragedy, Afrofabulation. I mean, there is a huge amount of diversity in the courses on offer. So that's a paper for which you're taught centrally in the faculty at the beginning of your third year. And after your 6 weeks of teaching in that paper, you go off and write an extended essay of, I think, 6,000 words. In fact, I know it's 6,000 words at the end of that term, which you then submit for examination. And then really the culmination of the undergraduate degree is the dissertation. And the dissertation you begin to think about at the end of your second year. Then over the summer between your second and third years, you do lots of reading and research. And then you work sort of intensively on your dissertation in the second term of your third year. Your dissertation is an 8,000 word piece of writing for which you receive specialised supervision, specialised tutorials. So all dissertations will be taught individually, one-to-one. For most of your tutorials through the course of the degree, you're taught by college tutors, your own college tutors. But when it comes to the dissertation, we'll often send you out to a tutor from another college, just because we always want to find for you the tutor who's most expert or has most expertise in whatever it is that you're wanting to study. The dissertation is entirely your own work. It's an independent project. Recent topics that some of my students have chosen have been really surprising things like, for example, the lyrics of Kanye West in comparison with the writings of Chaucer, looking at language and ideas and theories of race and ethnicity in both the medieval and the modern world. I said this yesterday and I'll say it again today because it's very important. I'm waiting for somebody to write a dissertation on Taylor Swift. So far, nobody has, but you could be the first. Anyway, Juan, could you just come up and say a little bit about your Shakespeare work?
And the special option.
And the special option and the dissertation.
Gotcha. I guess I'll start with the dissertation. Special option. To preface this, these coursework options really are the key facet by which diversity is extant in the course, because the range of things which you may pursue is almost limitless, really. So my special option, I'm doing a course called Elements of Criticism. And it's talking about eco-criticism, looking at how, for example, we may look at poetry, plays, or other works of literature through an environmental lens, even if they might not explicitly be about nature, even if they are explicitly about city-urban life, or even if you're looking at something medieval and they might not have the same sense of the environment as we do now. What can they tell us? What can we glean from it? What do we yield from looking at literature with a new lens? So that's the basis of the course. And for my dissertation, which is being supervised by Annie, I'm doing female anchorites or hermits or recluses in late medieval England. So as you can see, it bounces a lot from what you can do and what you feel like doing. If you really feel like doing a specific facet of late medieval history, you can. If you want to write specifically about Philip Pullman, you can. There are definitely more than enough professors that are able to do that for you. And for my Shakespeare portfolio, I'm doing 3 essays. Because I have a theatrical background, I decided to base the portfolio a lot more on what I know and what I'm interested in. And so the 3 essays are, the first one is on the pauses and breaths in Shakespearean soliloquies. The second one is in keeping time within various Shakespeare plays. And the third one is the movement of specific actors within film adaptations of Shakespeare. So the beauty of these papers is that it really gives you flexibility. The only limitation to the Shakespeare portfolio is that all of your writing has to be based around the text in some way. It doesn't mean you can only write about the text, but you can write about any facet of the text. If 3 plays happen to talk about this particular book, that's something to write about. It's really, the problem is always limiting yourself and finding a fixated point to work from, rather than being limited in what you can write about, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Juan. There's one other thing I want to just tell you about before I move on to talking about how we teach. And that is that this is the course that the vast majority of undergraduate students in English study in their second and third years. And we call it Course 1. However, you won't be surprised to know that there is another course that we call Course 2. And Course 2, well, I would say that of about 250 undergraduate students per year in English, about 210, 220 take the standard Course 1 pathway through the degree, but 30 or 40 every year take what we call Course 2. And in fact, it just so happens that both Arthur and Guan are Course 2 students. The Course 2 degree is really wonderful. It's a degree that allows students who are particularly interested in earlier literature and in the development of the English language to think in great detail about those and associated issues. You still come out of your degree with an Oxford degree in English. It doesn't change the fundamental identity of your degree, but it's a degree that just allows you, it's a pathway, that just allows you to specialise in very, very particular ways, and it's unique to Oxford. This isn't a course that's offered anywhere else. So you would take period papers in Old English literature, again, in Middle English literature. You would do a portfolio paper on the history of the English language. You would do a comparative literature paper looking at medieval English in conjunction with other medieval languages in translation. And then, as Course 2 students, you can do any one of the special options from Course 1 that you want to do, or you can pick from a Course 2 specific list, including brilliant things like archaeology and Old Norse and Old Celtic. It's a really, really wonderfully diverse degree. And then your dissertation can be on anything. So my student who wrote on Kanye West and Chaucer was a Course 2 student, but she didn't want to do her dissertation purely on medieval stuff, which is why she brought Kanye West in, and that's absolutely fine. Arthur, would you mind saying just a couple of words about why you have chosen Course 2?
Yeah, so I'd never studied sort of medieval English or Old English before, and I'd also never studied English language before this year. And so I felt that doing those papers this year, I kind of learned so much that I kind of had no idea existed before. And it sort of, I really, really enjoyed it, and I thought that this would be a great opportunity to sort of learn more new things and also have a kind of slightly more varied course, because you're not just sort of going through the periods, you're using different kind of methodologies, I guess, sort of going through the history of the English language. And also, I really like the idea of like going and looking at old books. So I'm quite looking forward to being able to do that.
Yeah, and I forgot to say that. That's the material text paper, which is a paper in which students actually work a bit in the Bodleian Library and get their hands on actual medieval manuscripts, actual medieval books, and think about the ways in which, or the processes through which medieval texts go in order to become 21st century edited texts, the texts that you study. So Course 2 is a unique selling point of the Oxford undergraduate degree. Anyway, I now just want to say a little bit to you more generally about how we teach in Oxford. So your teaching, if you were to come here, would be divided between the English faculty, which is where you are now, although as I said we're moving, and your own college. And the general division works like this. You attend lectures in the English faculty. Almost all of the lectures on offer are entirely optional. The only compulsory lectures of which I'm aware are the language and theory lectures in the first year. All other lectures are entirely optional, so you have the chance to organise your own timetable and to prioritise your own interests every term. What will happen is that at the beginning of every term you'll be emailed a link to the lecture list for that term, and you'll then go through it with your college tutor and pick out the lectures that you think might be most helpful and interesting to you. I mean, you could, if you were so inclined, go to lectures 5 days a week from 9 until 1. But in reality, what tends to happen is that students go to 1 or 2 a day, and that's a brilliantly enriching experience for you. It's also really wonderful to hear from tutors who aren't your college tutors, and to get different perspectives on texts. So that's what happens in the faculty. The rest of your teaching will take place in your college. Now, colleges vary. I mean, this is an important thing actually to look at when you're applying for colleges. Look at how many English students they take, because you might want a small group of English students in your college, or you might be more comfortable with a wider and more diverse group of students. It sort of averagely, I would say that most colleges take between 6 and 12 English students per year. In your college, you have weekly tutorials, which tend to be 2 of you and 1 tutor, sometimes just they're 1-to-1, and sometimes it'll be 3-to-1, just depending on what's happening that week and who's studying what. And then you'll also probably in your college have weekly seminars and classes. You may have one or 2, and that would be for groups of students from anything from 6 to 12. So that's what happens in your college, and you do get to know your college tutors really, really well while you're here. Now, the tutorial is really the foundation of everything that we do here. And in the way that we use it, it's really unique to both Oxford and Cambridge. There are 2 things that there's one thing that I want to say about it that's really important, is that you don't have to feel that you need to be somebody who's really loud and confident in order to thrive in a tutorial setting. The lovely thing about the tutorial is that it's a format in which shy students, quieter students, can gradually learn to thrive and to intellectually develop. It's a little bit less daunting, I think, as an undergraduate, to be asked to speak in pairs, in a group of 2 or a group of 6, than it is to be asked to speak in a group of 30 or 40. So you can thrive even if you're not on the confident side of things, I would say. In practical terms, what happens with your tutorials is that you will write an essay on a topic that you've agreed with your tutor. And your tutor will have given you a reading list and suggested essay questions, and you'll tend to have about a week in which to write this essay. You'll then hand it in to your tutor, generally the day before the tutorial, so that we have time to read your essay. And then we spend the tutorial discussing your essay. And if you're in a tutorial pair, which is most often the case, we will encourage you to talk about each other's essays and to communicate with each other. So it should be a sort of a three-way discussion, really. What we as tutors are trying to do in the tutorials is tease out your ideas, the ideas that you've begun to express in your essays. We're trying to encourage you to think about what worked in your argument and why it worked, and also what didn't work and why it didn't work. We just want to explore your really interesting ideas. Students, when they leave Oxford, often say that the tutorial was the space in which they really learnt to think. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. Every tutorial should start with what you think, not with what we as your tutors think. We can guide you, of course, but the whole point of the degree here is to equip you as individuals to think critically and creatively, to respond thoughtfully to texts and ideas and the world around you. And we always, as tutors, learn from you as our students. It's a very collaborative pedagogical process that you undergo in the tutorial setting. Most of your tutorials will take place in your own college, but as I said, in your 3rd year, we'll sometimes send you out to experts in other colleges just because they specialise in what it is that you want to do for your dissertation. Okay, I've got a few minutes left in which I'm going to talk briefly about the application process, and I might get both of you to come up and just say something about how you found it. In fact, I'm not going to talk about it, I'm going to let you two talk. So, do you want to come up? Yeah, go on, you come. If you could talk a little bit about the UCAS form, and that would be helpful.
So I guess the biggest difference is obviously there's no more ELAT. Don't take that as a cause for concern.
Sorry, the ELAT, just in case you don't know, the ELAT was the test that we have been setting for students prior, this is the entry exam, but that we've been setting for students prior to interviews. For the next year, the ELAT test isn't going to be running, so if you're applying for entry next year, you won't sit the ELAT. What's going to happen after that isn't yet entirely clear.
So don't take that as a cause for concern. I think from personal experience, and because I've been helping other people with guiding them through applications as well, the biggest thing you can keep in mind is to make sure that you are a genuine and authentic person, as can be seen in your application. Don't try to impress based on your breadth of reading, and don't try to impress because of your intellectual capacity. That's not quite the main focus of the application, I would say. For example, if you're writing a personal statement, it would be much nicer to see someone who's genuinely interested in the English course in their own way, by their own experiences, because that's unique. If you tell us that you've read 10 books, I'm pretty sure there are multiple professors here who have read 100 books. So that's not really the focus that we're looking for. Additionally, when it comes to the written work, it needs to be a marked piece of work, preferably by a teacher who has given you some form of comments or advice. It doesn't need to be solely good advice, solely good comments. We're really just looking to see how you've been taught, and we're looking to see how you think, how you write in response to that. And as a result, the written work that you submit, again, needs to reflect how you are as a student more than what mark it got, even if it even had a mark. For me, when I submitted my written work, it wasn't actually like the top mark I ever got. But as I was writing the essay, I was thinking, yeah, that's the one. I really like this. Didn't do that well, but I was like, this is how I think, this is how I write, and so I use that as my written work. So pick something that really reflects you as a student and as a person, because that's what keeps people interested, and that's what really makes people more compelling. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks. And then I'll just say one other thing about the UCAS form. Then if you could say something about interviews, that would be great. So don't get too anxious about your personal statement. The most important thing that you can do, as Guan said, is make sure that you sound like yourself in whatever it is that you write. Make sure that what you write makes grammatical sense. People get so anxious that they end up using convoluted sentences and long words that they don't quite understand, and even that the people reading the UCAS form might not quite understand. So really, really keep your UCAS form simple and clear. Just an articulation of who you are, as Guan said, and why it is that you love literature. You know, we are looking for students who love books, who love reading, so we do want you to talk about what you read, but don't feel, as Guan said, that there have to be particular genres of literature that we need you to excel in. We just want to know about what you read and why you love or why you don't love what it is that you're reading. And then the other thing I would say about UCAS 4, about the personal statement, is a really useful thing to do, although it sounds a bit weird, is once you've written it, to read it out loud. Read it out loud to yourself, read it out loud to your teachers, to your carers, your parents, whoever, and just get their feedback on whether or not what you have said actually makes sense and actually is an accurate reflection of who you are as a person. And then, Arthur, could you just say a little bit about your experience of interviews?
Yes, so just one thing sort of ahead of that is that I don't think there's not really sort of a set matrix of how, it's not sort of, oh, we'll base it 25% on how you've done in the interview. It's all kind of holistic. So if you sort of think, oh no, that was really dodgy, don't worry. It's kind of more global than that. But my interview, I had 2 interviews. I had one with the faculty and I had one with my college. But you might be interviewed at more than one college. You might not be interviewed at the college you applied to. That's completely fine. Don't worry about that. And so the first one was kind of, I got emailed a poem about 15 minutes before my interview. And then sort of I had to kind of talk about, what I thought it meant, sort of what I liked about it. And it was really just sort of an exercise in sort of thinking out loud and having suggestions of like, oh, have you thought about this? What do you think about this? And being able to kind of, take them on and go, I hadn't thought about that. Oh yeah, then maybe da-da-da-da-da. And so not being afraid to sort of go, oh, I don't know actually, let me think about that is a really important thing. And then my second interview was much more focused on sort of my personal statement, which was a little bit daunting because one of the texts I'd written about in my personal statement, I realised that the person interviewing me had written a book about. But it was a really great opportunity. It was a little bit stressful, I can't lie. But it's really fun to just be able to have that kind of in-depth intellectual discussion and be able to kind of hear what they think and what their viewpoint might be, and to be able to sort of have that bounce off against your own ideas. And I think that the interview process in itself is really quite rewarding and kind of fun, maybe. And so I think that it is a really enjoyable process, and you just have to kind of go into it with an open mind and not be afraid to kind of say something that you might think, oh, I'm going to sound stupid if I say that, because honestly, you will not. They've probably heard much worse.
Thank you, Arthur. Now, I think, Kim, have we got time for a couple of questions?
Yeah,
Or not?
5 minutes
Okay.
for open questions.
Okay. So does anyone... There's a question here.
With the 4 period papers, is it the same content every year? Is it like if you was to study books, for example, within the periods, are they always the same books or are they changeable?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, for people who are listening in other rooms, with the 4 period papers for course 1, is the content of the papers always the same, or can you sort of switch books and study things that you're particularly interested in? Luckily, the answer is that the content is never the same. There are no set... in fact, I should have said this, thank you. There are no set texts for any of these FHS papers at all, other than for the medieval paper, there's one set text, which is a long poem by Chaucer, which you have to get to know really well. But that's just so we can check that you can read and understand Middle English. Beyond that, there are no set texts. So you would come up really with your own syllabus in consultation with your college tutor, and depending a bit on the lectures that you're attending and what you're interested in. But we wouldn't ever throw you into the Victorian period and say, there you go off and find stuff out. I mean, we will give you guidance within your college and within the faculty. But if there are particular things that you're interested in, particular texts you're interested in, then you should absolutely have the opportunity to explore those.
Should I say that there are reading lists published by each college?
Oh yes, yeah, thank you, Gwen. You'll also have reading lists given to you by your college tutors, and there are also faculty reading lists that are accessible to you digitally. So there's loads of guidance on offer and loads of scope for your own freedom, intellectual freedom. There's in the black top here. Yeah.
The written work you submit for UCAS,
Mm-hmm.
does it have to be a persuasive essay or can it be fiction?
I would strongly advise you against submitting any creative writing. It needs to be a piece of literary linguistic analysis, whether that's of a book or an extract from a book or a play or poems, whatever. But because we don't offer creative writing as any part of the undergraduate degree here, it's actually not worth us examining your creative writing, because that's not how we're assessing you. So definitely a piece of literary analysis. Quite what form that piece takes is entirely up to you, but not creative writing. Having said that, we don't entirely hate creative writing at all. There'd be loads of opportunities for you as students to do creative writing in your colleges, in various university societies or whatever, but it isn't part of the undergraduate degree as a course, as a distinct course. At the blue shirt?
Does everyone submit written work with your personal statement at the same time, or do we submit our UCAS form and then you ask some people for written work?
Yeah, so no, everybody has to submit written work, but it's an entirely separate process from the UCAS process. So it's something. Were you asked by the college to send your written work? Do you remember, you two?
I'm not sure if it was the university or like the faculty
Yeah.
of the college, but that was a separate email.
Yeah, it'll be
You'll get email.
it will be an entirely separate process from UCAS, so it doesn't go through them at all.
Front and behind.
Should we have? Okay, front first, and then.
If you're like interested in a lot of different things, like is it okay if you talk about something different on your personal statement and then you submit written work in like a different genre?
Oh yeah,
different year?
yeah, absolutely.
Or like, do you think that it's like better to have one
No.
focus?
No, I think be authentic, be yourself. So if you have loads of different interests, then absolutely, make sure that's reflected in your application. We're completely not looking for students who are already thinking that they need to specialise in one genre or one period. We're looking for students who are sort of open to exploring all sorts of different texts and ideas and ways of thinking and periods. So don't feel at all that you need to portray yourself as a specialist in any one thing. That's absolutely fine. There was a question here.
I think behind first.
Okay, so one of which?
Behind
Oh,
first.
here. No, here. Should we do this one here and then that one? This one.
So in your personal statement, should you talk about poetry, prose and drama? Like if you're really interested in a specific aspect of drama, should you feel the pressure to speak about poetry?
No. I would say, again, sorry to keep saying it, but be authentic. So if you haven't read a great deal of poetry, don't feel that you need to convey the impression that you have. Partly because we might then ask you about it at your interview, and if you haven't actually read a great deal, it will be terribly awkward. So no, I would definitely talk about stuff that you have read and that you are enthusiastic about. And you can always convey a willingness to explore more, to find out more. But be authentic, be yourself. Don't pretend to have interests that you don't have, I think. One more, okay.
Would you recommend for the text that we write for the personal statement? Would you recommend to sort of sit down and write it just for that, or can we use something that we've done as a part of A levels that we thought was quite good?
You talk about your written work.
Yeah.
Oh, I would definitely submit something that you've done as part of your A level or your IB or whatever you're doing, because it's really, really important. And Gwan said this, it's really important that the piece that you submit to us is a piece that has been marked by a teacher. So even if you think your teacher's handwriting is messy and it messes up your beautiful essay, please send their comments to us as well as your essay, because it's very helpful for us to see how you've been taught. So yeah, a piece of work that's been marked. It could be an extract from your EPQ as well. It doesn't have to be an A-level piece, but a piece of literary critical writing marked by somebody. Great.
I know there are more questions, but we're going to have to stop it there. I will say, first of all, can we give a big round of applause for our student ambassadors.